Hey Al, we're ready when you are.
Hello, Burnell.
Well, good afternoon.
Judge Lang. Clinton Collins, how are you, brother?
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, okay, now I can see. Briefly. There I am, okay.
Long time no see, brother.
Yeah, really. We gotta stop meeting like this.
Hello, Al.
Hello? All of a sudden everybody went quiet.
Al is muted
Oh, okay.
and loading.
Al,
Well, again, good afternoon to everybody.
want to take over, Yusuf. You can go ahead and do that.
Here he comes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Judge Lang.
Good afternoon, Judge.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody.
Al, your mic is muted. He's having wavelength problems. Perhaps while we're waiting for Al, somebody might want to comment on the two Supreme Court cases that were ruled on this morning about voting in Arizona. The first case that they threw out had to do with ballots that were cast in the wrong precincts, and the second had to do with ballots that were cast by other people that were delivered early. And the Supreme Court ruled that both of those, which were thrown out by the courts in Arizona, were upheld, which the lower courts had found were discriminatory against black and brown voters. Do any of you have particular thoughts about those?
I'll defer to Judge Lang.
Or Burnell, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. The Supreme Court said ballot harvesting or carrying people's ballots to the correct location will not be allowed in that Arizona case. It penalizes people who live in high rises, who have transportation issues, or who work and need assistance getting the ballot to the correct place.
Mm-hmm.
They also said that if the precinct is changed or if you move and you cast a vote your vote won't count unless you're in the correct precinct. We had
Yeah.
that happen in Minneapolis where people who lived in zip code 55408 found their polling place change maybe 3 times in 4 years. So it's something we have to be mindful about in Minnesota with this ruling.
According to the Brennan Center, 880 bills have been introduced in 49 states proposing election law changes, and at least 28 of those bills have been signed into law. Would either of you care to speculate on why there has been such a rush to judgment to limit access to the polls in 49 states?
Well, I'm happy to offer what I have suggested in the past.
Yes,
Good
sir.
afternoon to everybody. And that is that the basic strategy of the Republican Party is to win by winning in the courts. The basic notion that the Republican Party is increasingly finding itself unable to win at the ballot box, and therefore must resort to various efforts to eliminate the opposition voters. And that effort is being driven by a strategy of divide and conquer, to which I'm sad to say, I believe that the Supreme Court has become a partner, essentially by eviscerating the Voter Rights Act. The court has now simply invited the individual states to do what they can, and has taken the position that it's going to essentially be hands off. Perhaps in the most egregious of situations, it might act, but today's rulings suggest that so long as the state has an interest in doing what it is doing, the court is going to say that's okay with us. If it's going to be changed, it has to be changed by the Congress, through an enactment of additional legislation.
Burnell, do you think the Supreme Court decision is going to make it more difficult to challenge the changes that they're attempting to make in the Georgia state legislature?
Yes, I think that what the court has done is basically invited the states to become activists in this regard, and to say that the court is not going to be the arbiter, that it will have to be done through politics, and that the politics that it will look to first are the politics in the state itself. And if you're not able to get the reforms that you need in the voting system through the state, then you must turn to the federal courts, and that the federal courts are going to have to move in such a way that they can convince the court that there is some, I think now, extraordinary need for the court to act, or the court will say hands off.
One final Supreme Court question. The Republican leadership in the United States Senate has indicated that they would refuse to forward a nominee from President Biden within 1 year of the end of his term for committee consideration, although they forwarded their last nominee under former President Trump within 8 days of the election. And normally, members of the Supreme Court would retire at the end of a Supreme Court term, and today happens to be the end of the current term, or they would announce that they were stepping down immediately following the end of a Supreme Court term. Do any of our guests suspect that there will be a resignation or a Supreme stepping down now that we're at the end of a Supreme Court term and there is a window for a possible nomination going forward? We have several Supremes in their 80s.
I'm sort of chuckling because when
The Supreme Court,
please, Judge.
Judge Lang. Go ahead, Judge Lang.
well, the Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment. The
Yes.
Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment. So there's no requirement that anyone step down at a certain point. However, there has been reports of interference and people being encouraged to step down before their demise. So we have to be watchful with regard to Supreme Court appointments.
Yeah, most of the resignations have occurred at the end of a Supreme Court term or when someone was at death's door, unfortunately.
I wanted to offer a personal observation. When I was at Harvard working on my LLM, preparing to go into teaching, one of the courses that I set in on was Judge Breyer's administrative law course. I wanted to basically learn at the feet of a master. And over the course of the semester, the one thing that I came away knowing was that Judge Breyer is a person who is extremely thoughtful and extremely principled. And with that attitude, I don't think that it is possible to do anything other than this, than to say, this is the decision that's in Judge Breyer's hand. He will make it independently and he will make it on the merits as he sees the merits.
Okay.
So I'm not surprised that we haven't heard anything today. I would not be surprised if he decided that he wanted to stay on, nor would I be surprised if he were to make an announcement in the coming weeks that that he's stepping down. I just don't think that there's any way to know.
Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to the host with the most, Al McFarlane. He can open up his mic and we can talk about former Officer Chauvin's 22.5-year sentence, about his surprise announcement during the sentencing hearing, and we might even want to comment on Bill Cosby's surprise reversal. Al, you want to turn your mic on and take it away?
I will, and Yusuf, thank you so much for stepping in for me. I'm in between a couple of projects here, so I'm trying to multitask, but this conversation is an important one, and I really, really, really appreciate both the depth of knowledge and interest and integrity that you bring to your work as a communicator and leader in our community. And I'm just comfortable that I could step away and invite you to move the ball down the court. But, you know, we had in mind talking about also those two items you mentioned. One is impressions from the legal scholars, experts here on the sentencing of Derek Chauvin. What are your thoughts, and how do you assess the feeling, the mood of the community, and how do we inform our communities to have principled discussions, arguments, to be comfortable in whether we like or dislike a decision that's been made, and how we articulate our differences of opinion and our agreements in ways that really help individuals become better thinkers, organizers, servants in community, civically engaged. That's question number one. And then, you know, Clinton, you and I talked earlier about the meaning of this shock announcement yesterday that Bill Cosby was being released from prison. And a lot of people are saying, oh, but he was guilty, or oh, but he did it, or oh, but, you know, a lot of oh, buts. And how do we, again, have that conversation where we understand what actually happened? I heard some commentators say, oh, released on a technicality, but others saying, don't diminish this to a mere technicality. There's something bigger afoot here. So those are the two things I wanted to discuss. And Judge Lang, so thankful for you being here. I wanted to start by asking you to weigh in on either of those discussions, and we'll follow from there. And I'm not sure, was she able to hear me? We lost her. Well, then, Clinton, why don't we start with you, and then Cousin Burnell jump in as well. Hey, Brenda, how are you?
Well, I guess I'll start with Cosby, because that's fresh in my mind. And I think now that I've had a chance to read the court's opinion, they were absolutely right. It's a deal is a deal. That's really what it kind of came down to. And as I mentioned to you, it reminded me of the case 2 or 3 decades ago involving Dan Cohen here in Minneapolis, who was promised by the Star Tribune that they would keep his identity a secret after he revealed that Marlene Johnson, who was the gubernatorial or the candidate for lieutenant governor at the time with Rudy Perpich, that she had a shoplifting conviction. And they broke the promise. They outed him. He had severe personal consequences. He sued them. And the Star Tribune said, well, hey, freedom of the press. We have a right to publicize this information because it's newsworthy. And Dan Cohen's position, which ultimately prevailed at the Supreme Court, was the First Amendment does not give you an absolute right to do whatever you want. And as a news organization, if you make a deal, you're stuck with it. And if you're not prepared to keep your promise to keep someone's identity anonymous, well, then don't make the promise. And it's basically that same premise in the Cosby case that, yeah, there's no question Cosby did all the stuff. But, and this is the big but, was that the prosecution in Pennsylvania had previously agreed to not criminally prosecute him. And the reason why they did that, why the prosecutor made that decision, was to apparently assist in the civil lawsuit. And because typically in a civil lawsuit, your rights and responsibilities are different, particularly when it comes to whether or not you can be forced to testify, incriminate yourself. And Cosby's argument, which again was, I think, the correct one legally, was he would have handled things differently if they hadn't made this promise to him. And there's a legal term when they call, when you rely on something to your detriment. And that's exactly what happened here at Cosby. Because of the promise of not being prosecuted criminally, he answered the questions in his civil lawsuit under oath in the deposition. And then that information was used to nail him to the wall in the criminal case. And the Pennsylvania court basically said, you can't have it both ways. Mm-hmm. And if you've made this deal with Bill Cosby, you have to honor it. And whether or not he's guilty is not insignificant, but we have to enforce the rules of the game. And if people don't follow the rules, then the outcome is not appropriate under our Constitution. I mean, it's the same concept about when evidence that's obtained illegally is thrown out. There have been many cases in which the courts have held that seizing certain evidence violated parts of the Constitution, particularly the Fourth Amendment dealing with search and seizures. And they've said, hey, even if sometimes innocent people or guilty people go free, we got to have a system that's fair, and we have to respect the rule of law. And unfortunately, doing that can lead to situations like this. But I guess if people are going to be angry at anybody, they should be angry at the Pennsylvania prosecutor who made the deal. I don't think there's any court in the country that would have ruled any differently, at least not at the state Supreme Court or federal level, with the same set of facts. Is it a deal? And
well, he made the deal to snitch on himself in exchange for immunity, and testified in court that he drugged the women and raped them. So in the court of public opinion, he's guilty as hell. Okay.
Absolutely.
And his reputation is shot. It's in the basement, trash can of history, quiet as it's kept. And he served almost 3 years of the 3 to 10 year sentence that he was given. So he's over the hill, and he's in isolation for the rest of his life. So he has no reputation to reclaim. And the prosecutor who made the deal with him was gone, and a new prosecutor came on board, was appointed, and then used his testimony that he had drugged and raped these women to indict and charge him, and then essentially convict him and send him to prison. So, the fact that he had been guaranteed immunity was the appeal that the judge found in his favor that got him out of prison. And, all of the legal experts were saying that there was no other recourse because, as you pointed out so soundly, Clinton, the deal was the deal, and they had to abide by it. But, Bill Cosby, the horse is out of the barn, quiet as it's kept, and there's no way that they're going to get it back in the stall at this point. If it was 1 or 2 women, people might be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But when the stack is 60 women high, the common denominator is Bill, and Bill, and there's absolutely no getting around that. That's a pretty tall stack to have to deal with. So, like him or not, those are the facts.
Yusuf, I think that I can agree with you that all of the social condemnation that you've described is now upon Bill Cosby. But I actually think that's not the really important issue that was at stake here. I think Clinton is on the mark exactly when he talks about what was at stake here, because what was at stake here was not simply Bill Cosby and his reputation. What was at stake here was the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. And that's not a technicality. That's a boulder. It's a boulder that we as a country have put in place to stop politicians like the one who was involved here from running roughshod over people's rights. That prosecutor, the second, I can't remember what his name was it Steele or Steller or something like that?
Yeah.
That prosecutor won office in large part on a commitment that he would go after Bill Cosby, and he would convict him.
And he did.
What I find surprising about this case is not the verdict that the Supreme Court came to in Pennsylvania, but the fact that it took so long. I'm not a trial lawyer, so I don't know why it was that it took 3 years for this issue to finally get before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. But my reaction almost from the beginning was, wait a minute, there's a problem here. There's a real problem here if they're going to use evidence from Cosby that he supposedly gave under a promise from the prosecution that they would not go after him criminally. And now when I hear, I heard a member of the prosecution staff essentially saying, well, this was a terrible injustice, and there was no actual agreement. There was nothing that was written down. And my reaction to that was, since when did we require a formalization of an agreement? The law is built upon the idea that when you know that something has happened and you have evidence that it has happened, that's enough. And the formalities usually will not be determinative. We're not talking about form, we're talking about substance.
Burnell?
Yes.
Do you think the lay people understood that, or does Cosby become OJ number 2?
I think that the important point is that it's the responsibility for those who know best, to speak up and make clear what's at stake in situations such as this.
Okay.
Because it may be Bill Cosby, someone who, quite frankly, has shown himself to be detestable, who's in the dock today. But it may be some other individual who we admire, who we want to succeed, who's in the dock tomorrow.
But for the grace of God.
Indeed.
Fair enough.
We may all be one bad prosecutor away from being in the situation that Bill Cosby was in.
And many of us have been.
I took a deep breath and said, finally, somebody stepped in and spoke definitively on this issue, because it worried me from the very beginning, even though I knew that Bill Cosby was everything negative that one can think of.
Yeah.
Judge Lang, we lost you for a while. Good to see you back. Did you want to weigh in on how does our community, the debate's going to go on now, and that's why this conversation is so important, because we get a chance to look at it through the consequence of the Fifth Amendment of the law of the Constitution, and we also look at it on the more personal, emotional side, whether we have a passionate, deep, feeling about the wrong done the number of women by Bill Cosby, or whether you look at it in another way. How does the community come to understand and have healthy debates about the entirety of this experience, and what it beyond Bill Cosby and those 60 women? It's bigger than that.
Well, America's had a long struggle with accusations by white women against black men of a sexual nature. And it's taken us almost 100 years in Minnesota to stand up and say the courts bungled the Duluth case, where 14 black men were held in jail on false charges. 3 were lynched, and 1 was convicted with no evidence of a crime. And so these procedural due process issues have been applied to us, and many times the wrongful conviction is overlooked because of race politics. So the criminal law and the standard of justice has always been made with despicable crimes. Miranda was horrible, but the protections that came from his particular case, Miranda versus Arizona, protect everybody to this day. So it's not the angelic person that gets pulled out in terms of the media and wrongfully convicted. It is a vulnerable person who will be disbelieved and discredited, or the color of their skin is weaponized against them.
Powerful. Thank you. And so what do we say to each other, Judge, when, we in our, living rooms and street, coffee shop conversations say, oh, he did it, and he was lucky. Is that the point of this whole thing? Or is there something more that you've just described that we should be conversant about and able to explain to each other and to ourselves? What do you think?
America has wrongfully convicted black men, like the Central Park men, the Jonesboro, so many people, to appease public furor. And we cannot go along and be a echo chamber for wrongful convictions. When a person their conviction is overturned, the presumption of innocence goes back on them. So they are not a guilty person who beat the system. They are an innocent person entitled to the full protection of the law.
Yusuf, that's different from what you were saying. You were saying, I think, that at least from the public perception, that people will hold him as guilty and responsible. Do you think
Well,
that?
he admitted in court to all of the charges that were against him. He did testify and plead guilty. And it was on that basis that he was subsequently convicted and sent to prison. But the other piece, Al, and I've been exposed to some of this, is that there is a gender distinction in terms of how this issue is perceived within our own community. And we need to be aware of that, because I've heard some barbershop discussions where black men have said, you know, that Bill was famous and he was rich, and that women threw himself at him. And some women have said, wait a minute, you know, I mean, we need to look at the way in which women have been abused and take advantage of, and not necessarily assume, okay, that the things that Bill testified to were not in fact all true in his admission of guilt. And I think that the eyes through which men and women view this case may not be necessarily in sync. And we need to be aware of that in our discussions across gender within our community, that men and women may have distinctly different opinions and takes on this whole entire matter. And that's been my experience.
To be clear on the phrase you used, Yusef, of admission of guilt, not in the criminal proceedings, but what you're referring to as admission of guilt were statements made in deposition in the civil trial. Is that correct? Am I right or wrong about that?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Okay.
Well, actually, I don't believe that he admitted to any form of guilt. I think that he admitted to some actions, and but his overall position was that all of the activities were consensual. I think that needs to be kept in mind for purposes of the record. But I also think that there's a related point here, and it's the point that the judge made so eloquently. Black people are sophisticated. We can hold two ideas in our mind at the same time. Bill Cosby is a bad person, but the legal principle that is involved here is one that ought to be upheld and respected. That's what these discussions, I think, ought to be putting forward.
One thing that I would like to add, I was just listening to all the thoughtful comments, is to emphasize to people that this, now putting the trial court stuff aside, what happened before, but looking at the Supreme Court decision from Pennsylvania, that it was racially neutral. It did not have anything to do with Cosby's race. The appellate decision. Basically, they said the prosecutor didn't play fair, they broke the rules, and we're not going to allow them to profit by their own misconduct. And I think under the same set of facts, that I'm pretty confident the Pennsylvania Supreme Court would have ruled the same way. In fact, I don't see how they could have ruled any other way. And I think that would be something to emphasize to people who think that Cosby got railroaded because he was black, or the court took a dim view, or whatever, the race was a factor at this stage. Now, was it a factor earlier? You can make that argument. But certainly at this stage, when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court looked at the facts, there was no question. There were certain facts that were beyond dispute, reasonable dispute. One was the prosecution made a deal with Cosby. Two, they didn't honor the deal. And then three, because they did not honor the deal, they placed him in a position where he was forced to incriminate himself. And I don't think any reasonable person with any iota of legal training would dispute those three basic points. And if you had had a white person in that same position with those same points, they would have reached the same conclusion. And I think that often, because of what Judge Lane said, there's a history of black men being unfalsely or falsely accused, killed in many cases, and race was definitely a factor. I think at this time, at this decision, I understand that ultimately as black people, we have to be willing to accept the rule of law as well, even if there is a bad history, and even if there have been horrible things that have in the past, that What we want is equal justice under law. And I think what happened with Cosby in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was equal justice under law.
I love the idea of explaining the concept of the rule of law. And the question I raise, Dean Powell and Judge Lang and Brother Clinton, is how do we then change the narrative in our community? How do we create both an awareness and an appreciation for the concept of rule of law, number one, and then an embrace of the principles and the strategies so that we reflect a sense of equity and ownership of both processes and outcomes. And therefore, we make a demand of society, including us, that fairness be at the center and that consistency and transparency be at the center of proceedings in all realms. Judge Lang, what do you think?
Well, it starts on the block. We allow the drug dealer and the gangster to roam around. We don't testify. If a person steps forward as a good Samaritan and gives evidence, they're executed. So we have to, as a community, decide whether or not we want, even at the block level, to have justice and protection. So we have retreated from that and allowed intimidation and other factors to take over the justice that we should insist on.
Well, and
Burnell,
I think we have to have some investment and ownership in the law. So we have to register to vote. We have to serve on jury duty. We have to assist with the reentry of people coming back into society from the criminal justice system, and we need to do our best to try and prevent people from going into it, whether it's through the school to prison pipeline or people selling drugs or what have you. Because, every time I go into prison, I'm thinking, darn, I could hold a school reunion up there. There's so many people that I know in the men and women's correctional facilities. So we need some investment and ownership in the correctional system and in the legal system in order to have some investment and ownership in the rule of law. And then only then can we support it and embrace it and encourage other people to do the same. Yeah. And until then, people are not gonna be willing to support it.
I don't think that I can add a lot substantively to what has been said. I do believe, however, that we ought to keep things in perspective. The rule of law is a difficult concept. The notion that decisions for a society are going to be made on the basis of principle, as opposed to the particular attitudes of the person who is making the decision. That's a very difficult concept. It is a difficult concept in our communities. It's a difficult concept around the world. Around the world, it is not the dominant concept for most people. And we have to, first of all, appreciate how complex the concept is, how unique it is, and because of that, how much effort it will require on our part, as has been suggested, in order to have that concept have life, continued life.
How do you separate? Let me throw something in the game here, Professor Powell. How do you separate the rule of law from white supremacist culture, from imperialism, from colonialism, and from cultural chauvinism, from the rule of power?
Well, I think that the notion of the rule of law is the very antithesis of the kind of demagoguery that you're asking about. If your society is driven by principles, it shouldn't make any difference what the nature of the particular individuals are. Not to get too esoteric here, but one of our great legal philosophers, Rawls, has put forth the notion of that the adequate metaphor here would be if all people were seated at a campfire with blindfolds and asked to make decisions as the questions are brought before them. You have the blindfold on, you don't know the nature of the individuals who are sitting around the campfire, so you can't make it in their favor or against it. But by the same token, the blindfold also blindfolds you. So you're put into a position of having to make a decision. And Rawls says that's the situation in which we can find justice. And the justice we want is the decision that works for all of us, independently of our particular attributes.
You know,
That is what we mean by the principle that's at stake here.
one thing I want to add, though, and I think I see where Al was going with this, with this part of his question. There was a time in this country within our lifetimes where a lot of things that are now deemed illegal were considered legal. I mean, I guess the most glaring example would be the Loving v. Virginia case, which was 1967. Up until that point, it was illegal in many southern states for a black person to marry a white person. Now, someone could argue that if you did that and you got in trouble, a white racist or someone could say, well, hey, you broke the law. The law is that this is not permitted. So there are times, or maybe other examples, or Nazi Germany passed all kinds of laws, and that was used as a defense in Nuremberg trials for war crimes. Well, we were just following German law. So I think that's the slippery slope about explaining the rule of law. The way I would explain it to people, what I try to do is I say, look at a football or a basketball game. You have a referee out there, they make a call, and there will be times you're not going to like the call. There'll be times when you're going to think, boy, they missed something. There'll be other times they'll make a call and you'll say, great, that helps my team win. But overall, during the course of the entire game, hopefully most people can come away saying, on balance, people were treated fairly. Some of the rulings went against me, some for me. But there had to be a structure, a uniform set of principles that both teams agreed to, or you couldn't have a basketball game or a football game. And I think the average person can understand it if you put it to them in that way. But I think Al's point, at least the point I believe he was getting to, is well taken, that not every country has a constitution like we do. And the saving grace for us as a nation was that when people passed these discriminatory laws, there was another document that superseded it in authority. And people like Thurgood Marshall could argue, all right, sure, maybe that's the law in Mississippi, but that's not what our Constitution dictates. And so I think in responding to rule of law concerns, what I've tried to explain to people is, one, we have a Constitution. And it's one that most of the Western world is modeled, that they have a written Constitution that supersedes even bad state laws. But that there have been bad Supreme Court decisions. I mean, look at Plessy v. Ferguson as an example, that said that black people, were less than human, basically. And eventually the court corrected itself. Or you look at Plessy v. Ferguson, the one that legalized Jim Crow. And Justice Harlan was the sole dissent. He said, in the eyes of the law, that our Constitution was colorblind. That did not carry the case in 1896. And it wasn't until the 1950s, leading up to Brown and the decisions after that, that Plessy was reversed. So, I think we, as lawyers, we have to acknowledge that even sometimes, courts can get it wrong. And the system has gotten it wrong. But that ultimately, with a few exceptions, our Constitution is on the money. And that is, for us, the ultimate rule of law. But not everybody has a Constitution.
Justice Harlan's dissent was taken out of law books for 40 years so that the legal community didn't have access to his reasoning. The American Bar Association became segregated and removed black lawyers, so we had to form the National Bar Association. So the tentacles of white supremacy are very pervasive and go to unusual lengths to maintain itself.
Listen, we're out of time. What a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Judge LeJune Lang, thank you so much for being here. As
Yeah.
always, Dean Emeritus Brunel Venable Powell, thank you, my friend, and my lawyer in the past, Attorney Clinton Collins, and my colleague and friend, Yusuf Mjini, of course, Brenda Lau Gray, reporter extraordinaire. Thank you all for being here, and thank those of you who are listening. We'll
Thank
be
you,
here again
Al.
next week. We'll be here again next week, and this is a conversation worth having. We thank you for being a part of it. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Take care now.